February 1st, 1944, 0630 hours. Kwajalein Atoll, Marshall Islands. Lieutenant Alexander Vandegrift adjusts his diving goggles against the salt spray, feeling the rubber seals press into his skin as the landing craft pitches in 4-foot swells 2,000 yards off the Japanese-held beach. His swim fins dangle from his left hand, black rubber flippers that cost the Navy $12.37 per pair, according to the procurement manifest he'd signed 3 weeks ago at Pearl Harbor. The only other equipment strapped to his nearly naked body: a canvas demolition bag containing 8 pounds of TNT, 2 detonators, and 100 feet of primacord. The brass had called them expendable. The Joint Chiefs had used that exact word during the briefing at Pacific Fleet Headquarters, referring to the 80 men of Underwater Demolition Team 1 as acceptable losses in the beach reconnaissance phase. Vandegrift remembers the way Admiral Nimitz had shifted in his chair when Captain Morrison suggested they were sending swimmers to their deaths. The old man hadn't disagreed. Now, as Vandegrift slides over the gunwale into water that registers exactly 78 degrees on his skin, he can see the Japanese machine gun positions dug into the coral reef 300 yards ahead. Dark rectangles of reinforced concrete with narrow firing slits, each one capable of traversing 120 degrees of overlapping fire. The enemy had 18 months to prepare these defenses. They knew the Americans were coming. Vandegrift kicks his fins twice, establishing his rhythm at 42 strokes per minute, the cadence drilled into him during 6 weeks of training off San Diego. His breathing apparatus, nothing more than a snorkel tube and mask, creates a small wake as he moves through the surface tension. Behind him, 79 other swimmers spread out in a line formation, each man responsible for a 25-yard section of beach obstacles. The first Japanese pillbox opens fire at exactly 0657 hours. Vandegrift hears the distinctive crack of a Nambu Type 92 machine gun before he sees the muzzle flash. 7.7mm rounds snap past his head, creating small geysers in the water 18 inches to his left. The orthodox tactical response, according to every amphibious warfare manual written by the Marines, would be to dive deep and abort the mission. No swimmer could survive sustained machine gun fire in open water. But the UDT training had taught them something different, something that went against every instinct hammered into conventional forces. Vandegrift kicks harder, accelerating toward the source of the gunfire instead of away from it. The machine gun barrel, elevated at 15 degrees above the waterline to engage landing craft, cannot depress low enough to track a swimmer moving directly beneath its field of fire. Physics and geometry, not courage, dictate his survival. The concrete emplacement looms larger as he closes the distance, coral growth and barnacles visible on its seaward face. Vandegrift can see the Japanese gunner's hands adjusting the weapon's elevation wheel, trying desperately to lower the barrel angle. Too late. At 30 yards from the pillbox, Vandegrift's fins touch the coral bottom. He plants both feet, removes the TNT charge from his demolition bag, and arms the detonator with a 90-second delay. The explosive package weighs exactly 4 pounds and 2 ounces, enough to collapse the reinforced concrete walls if placed against the structural foundation. The Japanese gunner is screaming orders to his loader, the words lost in the mechanical clatter of the weapon's bolt assembly. Neither man sees Vandegrift's surface directly beneath their position. He presses the charge against the concrete footing where the pillbox meets the reef, activates the timer, and kicks away from the structure. 87 seconds to detonation. The explosion tears through the coral at 0701 hours, lifting 3 tons of concrete and steel into the air before dropping it back into the lagoon. The machine gun falls silent, 1 down. 17 more pillboxes to go. The sulfur stench of Iwo Jima hit Vandegrift's nostrils 3 miles offshore on the morning of February 19, 1945, carried by prevailing winds that had blown across 8 square miles of volcanic ash and entrenched Japanese positions for the past 6 months. Through his field glasses, he could count 47 concrete bunkers carved directly into the island's black sand beaches, each one connected to an underground tunnel system that intelligence estimated stretched for 16 miles beneath the surface. 22,000 Japanese defenders had spent 2 years turning every cave, every ridge, every piece of high ground into interlocking fields of fire designed to kill Americans. The brass had learned from Kwajalein. This time, UDT operations would precede the main assault by exactly 18 hours, giving Vandegrift and his 79 swimmers a full day and night to map every obstacle, every mine, every killing zone before the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions hit the beaches at 0800 on the 20th. The mission profile called for complete hydrographic reconnaissance of the landing zones, plus demolition of all underwater obstacles within 500 yards of the high tide mark. Vandegrift checked his depth gauge as the rubber boat approached the release point 2,000 yards from Red Beach 1. Water temperature held steady at 68 degrees, 10 degrees colder than the Marshall Islands, cold enough to induce hypothermia in a swimmer after 4 hours of continuous exposure. His new equipment reflected lessons learned from 8 months of Pacific operations, a thicker wetsuit fabricated from quarter-inch neoprene, an improved rebreather system that recycled exhaled carbon, dioxide through a chemical scrubber, and waterproof charges packed with composition C2 explosive instead of the unreliable TNT they'd used at Kwajalein. The Japanese had learned too. As Vandegrift slipped into the water at 06:15 hours, he could see they'd positioned their beach defenses differently this time. Instead of fixed machine gun nests above the waterline, they'd installed mobile mortar positions that could engage targets anywhere in the surf zone. Wooden stakes driven into the coral bottom at precise intervals indicated pre-registered firing solutions, each one calculated to deliver 81mm high explosive rounds exactly where American swimmers would have to surface. Vandegrift kicked toward the beach at his standard 42 strokes per minute, staying submerged for 90-second intervals before rising just long enough to take a compass bearing and identify his next objective. The coral reef dropped away beneath him at a 45-degree angle, creating natural channels that funneled any approaching swimmer directly toward the Japanese observation posts. No choice but to use the terrain. At 400 yards from shore, his fins struck the first obstacle. A steel tetrahedron, 7 feet high and weighing approximately 800 pounds, welded from railroad rails and positioned to rip the bottom out of any landing craft that tried to cross the reef at high tide. Vandegrift counted 12 more identical structures arranged in a defensive line, each one spaced exactly 30 yards apart to create overlapping zones of destruction. He surface swam to the nearest tetrahedron and began placing charges. The new C2 explosive required only 3 pounds to sever hardened steel, compared to the 8 pounds of TNT he'd needed at Kwajalein. Each charge came with a delayed action detonator that could be set for any interval between 30 seconds and 12 hours. Vandegrift armed his first charge for a 6-hour delay, ensuring the obstacles would detonate just as the morning assault wave approached the beach. A rifle shot cracked across the water from the direction of the Japanese positions. Then another. Vandegrift looked up to see muzzle flashes winking from 3 separate bunkers, the shooters trying to bracket his position with aimed fire. Individual riflemen, not machine gunners. That meant they could see him clearly enough to engage with precision weapons. The orthodox response was immediate submersion and evasion. But Vandegrift had learned that Japanese marksmen expected swimmers to dive when fired upon, leading their targets toward deeper water where escape was most likely. Standard tactical doctrine made you predictable. He swam directly toward the gunfire instead. The Japanese rifles cracked again, their bullets splashing 10 yards behind him as he closed the distance to shore. At 200 yards, he could make out individual soldiers moving between the bunker positions, trying to maintain visual contact with the American swimmer, who refused to behave according to their training manuals. Vandegrift reached the second line of obstacles at exactly 07:43 hours. These were different. Concrete dragon's teeth, pyramid-shaped anti-tank barriers arranged in staggered rows designed to channel landing craft into killing zones covered by enfilade fire from the flanks. Each pyramid stood 4 feet above the high tide line and extended 6 feet below the surface, positioned with mathematical precision to create narrow passages that would force American boats into single-file approaches. He placed his second charge against the seaward face of the center pyramid, arming the detonator for the same 6-hour delay. The concrete felt warm against his palm, heated by the volcanic activity that had created this island 40,000 years ago. Somewhere above him, Japanese soldiers were adjusting their rifle sights and calling ranges to each other in voices he could almost understand. The third obstacle line consisted of wooden posts driven into the coral and connected by steel cables designed to entangle the propellers of landing craft. Vandegrift counted 47 posts arranged in a zigzag pattern that extended from the low tide mark to a depth of 12 feet. Each post had been cut from hardwood trees and treated with creosote to prevent marine borers from weakening the structure. The cables were 3/4-inch steel aircraft wire, strong enough to stop a Sherman tank. As he worked to place charges on the cable anchors, Vandegrift became aware of movement in the water around him. Not Japanese defenders, but sea life disturbed by the morning's activities. A school of yellowfin tuna swept past his position, their silver flanks flashing in the early sunlight. Triggerfish darted between the coral formations. their territorial instincts activated by the presence of human intruders in their reef ecosystem. The Japanese had stopped shooting. Vandegrift raised his head above the surface and scanned the beach positions through salt-stung eyes. The bunkers remained silent, their dark firing ports giving no indication of the activity within. Either they'd lost visual contact with his position, or they were waiting for him to move into a predetermined kill zone. He armed the cable charges with 4-hour delays, staggering the detonation times to create a sequence of explosions that would clear the obstacles in the correct order for the approaching landing craft. The first blast would sever the cables. The second would topple the dragon's teeth. The third would eliminate the tetrahedrons. Perfect timing required precise calculation of tidal variations, wind effects, and the speed of the incoming assault waves. At 0827 hours, Vandegrift reached the final obstacle belt. Here, the Japanese had installed something he'd never encountered before: pressure-activated mines buried in the coral sand, each one containing enough explosive to destroy a medium landing craft. The mines were virtually invisible from the surface, marked only by slight discolorations in the sand where the burial sites had been disturbed. He found the first mine by probing the bottom with a steel rod, feeling the metallic click as the tip struck the mine's pressure plate. The device had been manufactured in Japan, stamped with characters that indicated a Navy Type 93 contact mine containing 45 pounds of picric acid explosive. A direct hit from one of these weapons would vaporize everything within a 50-foot radius. Vandegrift placed his final charges with 30-minute delays, short enough to clear the mines before the assault waves arrived, but long enough to give him time to swim clear of the blast radius. As he armed the last detonator, he could hear the distant rumble of American naval guns beginning the preliminary bombardment. The battleships had opened fire right on schedule. The beach obstacles would be gone in 6 hours. The Marines would find clear lanes to the shore. The mission was complete. But as Vandegrift began his swim back to the pickup point, he realized the Japanese had been watching everything, learning, adapting. The next island would be different, harder. The hunt was just beginning. The limestone cliffs of Okinawa rose 300 feet above the East China Sea on the morning of April 1st, 1945, their white faces scarred by 2 months of American naval bombardment that had failed to dislodge a single Japanese defender from the tunnel systems carved into the rock. Vandegrift studied the terrain through his periscope from a position 2 miles offshore, counting 17 separate cave entrances that intelligence had missed during their aerial reconnaissance flights. Each opening led to a network of interconnected passages where 30,000 Japanese soldiers waited with enough ammunition and supplies to fight for 6 months. The enemy had learned from Iwo Jima. Instead of positioning their defenses on the beaches where naval gunfire could reach them, they'd pulled back into the interior hills and created interlocking fields of fire that would turn every rice paddy, every village, every piece of open ground into a killing zone. The beaches themselves appeared almost undefended, dotted with only a handful of concrete emplacements and wooden obstacles that looked primitive compared to the sophisticated barriers Vandegrift had encountered on previous operations. Corporal Jack Thomas floated beside him in the pre-dawn darkness, checking the waterproof chronometer strapped to his wrist that showed 0547 hours. Thomas had volunteered for this mission despite taking shrapnel fragments in his left shoulder during the Iwo Jima operation, metal splinters that Navy surgeons had decided were too close to major blood vessels to remove safely. The wound had healed enough to pass the medical evaluation, but Thomas still favored his right arm when placing demolition charges. The UDT mission profile for Okinawa differed from their previous operations in several critical aspects. Instead of clearing beach obstacles for a direct amphibious assault, they were tasked with reconnaissance and sabotage missions designed to support a deception operation. American planners wanted the Japanese to believe the main landing would occur on the heavily fortified southern beaches, while the actual assault targeted the lightly defended western coast. Vandegrift and his swimmers would create enough noise and destruction on the south shore to convince enemy commanders that 60,000 Marines were coming their way. Thomas pointed toward a concrete structure partially hidden by camouflage netting at the base of the cliffs. The bunker measured approximately 40 feet square, with walls thick enough to withstand direct hits from 16-inch naval guns. Its firing ports covered the approaches to 3 separate beach sectors, and telephone cables running up the cliff face connected it to observation posts on the high ground. Intelligence reports indicated the bunker housed a Type 96 25mm anti-aircraft gun that had been modified for ground targets. Vandegrift kicked toward the structure through water that registered 72 degrees on his skin, warm enough to prevent hypothermia during extended operations, but cold enough to sap strength from muscles that had been working for 3 hours. His equipment load included 12 pounds of composition C4 explosive, enough to collapse the bunker's roof and seal the gun crew inside their concrete tomb. The charges came with variable delay detonators that could be set for any interval between 10 minutes and 24 hours. The coral reef extended farther from shore than expected, forcing Vandegrift to swim an additional 400 yards through water, shallow enough to expose his position to Japanese observers on the cliffs. He could see individual soldiers moving between the cave entrances, their khaki uniforms blending with the limestone rock until movement gave them away. Some carried rifles. Others hefted wooden crates that probably contained ammunition or explosives. At 200 yards from the bunker, Vandegrift encountered the first surprise. The Japanese had installed underwater obstacles that didn't appear on any reconnaissance photographs. Steel rails driven into the coral bottom at 45-degree angles, each one topped with a contact mine containing enough explosive to kill a swimmer within 30 feet. The rails were spaced at irregular intervals designed to funnel approaching divers into predetermined channels, where machine gunners could engage them from concealed positions. Thomas swam up beside him and pointed toward a narrow gap between two of the mined rails. The passage was barely wide enough for a single swimmer, but it offered the only safe approach to the concrete bunker. Vandegrift checked his compass bearing and kicked through the opening, feeling the steel rails scrape against his equipment pack as he squeezed between the obstacles. A rifle bullet cracked past his head as he emerged from the gap. Then another. The shots came from a spider hole dug into the beach sand 30 yards ahead, its occupant firing through a camouflaged opening that was invisible until muzzle flash gave away his position. The Japanese sniper had been waiting for American swimmers to use the gap between the mined obstacles, turning their safe passage into another killing zone. Vandegrift dove beneath the surface and swam directly toward the spider hole, using the same tactic that had worked at Kwajalein and Iwo Jima. The sniper could track a surface target, but couldn't engage an underwater swimmer moving toward his position. Physics dictated the outcome. He surfaced 15 feet from the concealed position and lobbed a 2-pound demolition charge into the opening before the Japanese soldier could shift his rifle to a new target. The explosion collapsed the spider hole and eliminated the threat, but it also announced Vandegrift's presence to every enemy position within half a mile. Machine gun fire erupted from 3 separate locations along the beach. Type 96 light machine guns firing 6.5mm rounds at a cyclic rate of 450 rounds per minute, their muzzle flashes creating strobing patterns in the pre-dawn darkness. The gunners had established interlocking fields of fire that covered every possible approach to the concrete bunker. Thomas reached the bunker's seaward face at exactly 0623 hours, pressing his demolition charges against the concrete foundation where structural engineers had calculated the building's load-bearing capacity was concentrated. His wounded shoulder made the placement awkward, forcing him to use his right hand exclusively while treading water with his fins alone. The concrete felt warm against Vandegrift's palm as he placed his own charges on the bunker's eastern wall. Geothermal activity from Okinawa's volcanic substrate heated the limestone bedrock to temperatures that remained constant year-round, creating microclimates that the Japanese had learned to exploit for underground living spaces. Machine gun bullets chipped concrete fragments from the bunker walls as both swimmers worked to complete their sabotage mission. The Japanese gunners were firing blind, spraying ammunition at suspected positions rather than engaging specific targets they could see. Desperation tactics from defenders who knew they were about to lose a critical strong point. Vandegrift armed his detonators with 30-minute delays, long enough to swim clear of the blast radius, but short enough to support the deception operations timeline. American naval bombardment would begin in exactly 37 minutes, and the bunker needed to explode during the opening barrage to convince Japanese observers that naval gunfire had scored a direct hit. As he prepared to withdraw from the target area, Vandegrift spotted movement in the cave entrances high on the cliff face. Japanese soldiers were emerging from their tunnel systems, carrying what appeared to be rocket-propelled weapons. Intelligence had reported that enemy forces possessed American-made bazookas captured during earlier fighting, but seeing them deployed against swimmers represented a tactical innovation that increased the threat level dramatically. The first rocket streaked down from the cliffs at 0631 hours, its warhead detonating in the water 40 feet from Vandegrift's position. The explosion created a waterspout that rose 30 feet into the air and generated shockwaves strong enough to rupture human eardrums at close range. 2 more rockets followed within seconds, their impact points bracketing the area where the American swimmers had last been observed. Thomas kicked away from the bunker and dove to a depth of 20 feet, using the coral reef formations as cover while he navigated back toward the gap in the mined obstacles. Blood leaked from his wounded shoulder, where the exertion had reopened partially healed tissue, creating a thin red trail that would be visible to Japanese observers as soon as daylight improved. The bunker exploded at 0703 hours, right on schedule. 60 pounds of composition C4 detonated simultaneously, collapsing the concrete roof and sealing the anti-aircraft gun crew inside their fortress. Secondary explosions followed as stored ammunition cooked off, creating a fireball that rose 200 feet above the beach. From his position in the water, 500 yards offshore, Van de Grift watched Japanese soldiers pour out of the cave entrances like disturbed ants. Radio communications between the cliff positions increased in volume and urgency as enemy commanders tried to assess the extent of American penetration into their defensive zone. The deception was working. But 30,000 Japanese defenders remained in those tunnels, and they would be waiting when the real assault began. The casualty reports from the 10th Army reached Van de Grift's position at 0815 hours on April 16th, transmitted by radio from the command ship anchored 12 miles offshore. 27,000 American casualties in 15 days of fighting. The Japanese had turned every cave, every ridge, every village into a fortress that required grenades, flamethrowers, and demolition charges to clear. Progress measured in yards per day instead of miles per hour. Private First Class. William Reynolds floated beside Van de Grift in the warm water off Shuri Castle, his left leg wrapped in waterproof bandages that covered shrapnel wounds received during a reconnaissance mission 3 days earlier. Reynolds had insisted on returning to duty despite the Navy surgeon's recommendation for medical evacuation to Pearl Harbor. The WAM? UDT was losing men faster than replacements could be trained and shipped from the States. Every experienced swimmer counted. The mission profile had changed again. Instead of beach reconnaissance and obstacle clearance, the UDT teams were now conducting sabotage operations behind enemy lines, using the extensive cave systems that honeycombed Okinawa's limestone terrain to penetrate Japanese defensive positions from unexpected directions. Intelligence had identified 17 separate tunnel networks that connected the main defensive lines to supply depots and ammunition storage areas located miles inland. Reynolds checked his equipment one final time before beginning the infiltration. His rebreather system had been modified with extended duration carbon dioxide scrubbers that would allow 6 hours of underwater operation without surfacing. The demolition charges in his waterproof pack contained a new type of plastic explosive, designated Composition C3, more stable than the C2 they'd used at Iwo Jima, but with twice the destructive power per pound of material. The cave entrance lay 30 feet below the surface, carved by centuries of wave action into the coral reef that formed Okinawa's southern coastline. Van de Grift had located the opening during a night reconnaissance mission, swimming through underwater passages that stretched for half a mile before emerging in a flooded chamber beneath the Japanese defensive complex. The tunnels connected to dry passages that led directly to enemy ammunition storage areas. Sergeant Isamu Hasegawa's defensive positions controlled the high ground above the cave system, machine gun nests and mortar pits positioned to cover every approach route across the open terrain that separated American forces from the Shuri defensive line. Hasegawa had spent 2 years preparing these positions, studying aerial photographs, and captured American tactical manuals to understand how U.S. forces would attempt to breach his fortifications. He'd positioned his strongest units in locations where conventional assault tactics would fail. Van de Grift descended through the cave entrance at 0930 hours, following a compass bearing that would take him through the flooded passages toward the enemy supply depot. The water inside the caves maintained a constant temperature of 74 degrees, heated by geothermal springs that bubbled up through fissures in the limestone bedrock. Phosphorescent algae growing on the cave walls created an eerie green glow that provided just enough illumination to navigate without artificial lighting. The tunnel system proved more extensive than intelligence reports had indicated. Side passages branched off in multiple directions, creating a maze of interconnected chambers that could easily disorient a swimmer who lost his compass bearing. Van de Grift marked his route by placing small reflective tabs at decision points, creating a trail he could follow during the withdrawal phase of the CIDES mission. Reynolds swam 50 yards behind him, moving slowly to conserve oxygen and avoid creating surface disturbances that might alert Japanese sentries to their presence. His wounded leg made swimming difficult, forcing him to rely primarily on his arms for propulsion while using his fins only for steering and depth control. Blood seepage from the bandaged wounds created a faint trail in the water. At 400 yards from the entrance, Vandegrift's outstretched hand touched concrete. The tunnel had led him to the foundation of a Japanese supply bunker, its walls extending 8 feet below the water level and presumably much higher above the surface. Waterproof electrical cables ran along the concrete foundation, carrying power from generators located somewhere in the dry sections of the complex. He placed his first demolition charge against the bunker's structural foundation, using a magnetic clamp to ensure the explosive would remain in position despite water currents flowing through the tunnel system. The charge contained 6 pounds of C3 explosive with a timer delay that could be set for any interval between 1 hour and 12 hours. Vandegrift armed the detonator for a 4-hour delay, giving him time to complete the sabotage mission and withdraw to safety. The sound of voices echoed through the water from somewhere above his position. Japanese soldiers were moving around inside the supply bunker, their conversations muffled by the concrete walls but audible through the water-filled foundation. Vandegrift could distinguish at least 3 separate voices, probably sentries checking the ammunition storage areas according to some predetermined schedule. Reynolds reached the second bunker at 10:47 hours, his progress slowed by the need to navigate around steel reinforcing bars that protruded from the concrete foundation like underwater spikes. The Japanese engineers who designed these structures had extended the foundations deep into the bedrock to prevent exactly the kind of sabotage mission that Vandegrift and Reynolds were now conducting. A machine gun opened fire somewhere above the water level, its bullets striking concrete and ricocheting through the tunnel system with metallic whining sounds that reverberated off the limestone walls. The Japanese had discovered something, either American forces approaching their positions from the landward side or evidence of the UDT infiltration through the cave system. Either possibility meant the sabotage mission was compromised. Vandegrift accelerated his placement of demolition charges, swimming from bunker to bunker and attaching explosives to structural foundations without taking time for the careful reconnaissance that normally preceded such operations. Speed now mattered more than precision. The charges would either destroy the enemy supply depot or they wouldn't, but remaining in the tunnel system much longer would guarantee capture or death. The third bunker contained something unexpected. As Vandegrift attached his explosive charge to the foundation, he could hear machinery operating inside the structure. Not voices or footsteps, but the mechanical sounds of pumps or generators running at constant speed. The electrical cables he'd noticed earlier all led to this building, suggesting it housed the power plant that supplied electricity to the entire defensive complex. Reynolds appeared beside him in the green-tinged water, pointing toward his chronometer and making hand signals that indicated they'd been underwater for 3 hours and 47 minutes. The rebreather systems had enough scrubber capacity remaining for perhaps 30 more minutes of operation, barely enough time to swim back through the cave system to the entrance. The machine gun fire above them intensified, joined by the cracking sounds of rifle fire and the distinctive thump of mortar rounds detonating against limestone cliffs. American forces were conducting some kind of assault against Hasegawa's positions, creating enough noise and confusion to mask the UDT withdrawal through the underwater tunnels. Vandegrift armed the final charge with a 2-hour delay, synchronizing the detonation time with the explosives he'd already placed on the other bunkers. 6 simultaneous explosions would collapse the supply depot's foundations and flood the lower levels with seawater, destroying ammunition and equipment that the Japanese garrison needed to continue their resistance. As he began swimming back toward the cave entrance, Vandegrift realized that something fundamental had changed during this mission. The Japanese were no longer the invulnerable enemy they'd appeared to be during the early stages of the Pacific War. Their positions could be penetrated, their supply lines could be severed, their carefully prepared defenses could be turned against them by men who refused to accept that certain objectives were impossible to achieve. But the cost was becoming unbearable. Reynolds was swimming slower now, his wounded leg trailing blood that would attract predators if they remained in the water much longer. 7 UDT swimmers had been killed or wounded during the past week alone, and replacements were arriving from training camps in California with barely enough experience to handle basic demolition missions. The cave entrance appeared ahead of them at 11:53 hours, a circle of blue water that marked their passage back to the world above. Vandegrift could see Reynolds struggling to maintain depth control, his rebreather system showing red warning indicators that suggested carbon dioxide buildup in the breathing mixture. They surfaced together in the warm Pacific sunlight, gasping air that tasted clean after hours of recycled atmosphere in the underwater tunnels. Behind them, the limestone cliffs of Okinawa rose like fortress walls, scarred by battle, but still held by an enemy who would fight to the death rather than surrender. The charges would detonate in 97 minutes. The supply depot would be destroyed, but 30,000 Japanese soldiers would still be waiting in their tunnels when the assault resumed. The war was far from over. The surrender announcement reached Vandegrift through his radio headset at 0815 hours on August 15, 1945, transmitted from Admiral Nimitz's flagship anchored in Tokyo Bay, where representatives of the Japanese government had agreed to formal capitulation terms. Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled through static interference as he informed his people that the war had ended, that continued resistance would only bring more suffering to a nation already devastated by atomic weapons and conventional bombing. Thomas floated beside him in the quiet waters off Yokosuka Naval Base, checking his dive watch that showed they'd been in the water for 3 hours and 27 minutes, conducting what would probably be their final reconnaissance mission of the war. The Japanese had scuttled most of their remaining warships rather than allow them to fall into American hands, creating underwater obstacles that needed to be mapped before occupation forces could use the harbor facilities. The silence felt wrong. No machine gun fire echoing across the water. No mortar rounds detonating against coral reefs. No rifle bullets cracking past their heads as they swam toward enemy-held beaches. Just the gentle lapping of waves against concrete seawalls and the distant sound of American ships' horns announcing the end of hostilities. Reynolds had been evacuated to a hospital ship 3 weeks earlier, his wounded leg infected with tropical bacteria that Navy surgeons couldn't control with the antibiotics available in the forward medical units. Vandegrift had visited him before the medical transport departed for Pearl Harbor, finding Reynolds unconscious and running a fever that reached 104 degrees, despite continuous cooling treatments. 43 UDT swimmers had died during the Pacific Campaign. Another 67 had been wounded severely enough to require medical evacuation. Out of the original 80 men who'd entered the water at Kwajalein 18 months ago, only 23 remained on active duty. The casualty rate exceeded 90%, higher than any other unit in the Navy except the submarine service. The brass were already talking about restructuring the program. Peacetime budgets would eliminate most of the specialized units that had proven essential during the war, consolidating the remaining swimmers into a single organization responsible for underwater salvage and harbor clearance operations. The innovation, the tactical flexibility, the willingness to attempt impossible missions would disappear into bureaucratic efficiency reports. Vandegrift removed his rebreather mouthpiece and floated on his back, staring up at clouds that moved across the sky without the contrails of enemy aircraft or the black smoke of naval gunfire. The water temperature registered 76 degrees on his skin, warm enough to remain comfortable for extended periods, but lacking the sense of urgency that had driven every previous mission. Japanese civilians were appearing on the docks and waterfront areas, waving white flags and displaying surrender leaflets printed in both Japanese and English. Many looked relieved rather than defeated, as if the burden of supporting a hopeless war had finally been lifted from their shoulders. Children pointed at the American swimmers with curiosity rather than fear. Thomas swam over to a partially submerged destroyer that had been scuttled in the harbor entrance, its superstructure rising 15 feet above the water level, while its hull rested on the bottom in 40 feet of water. The ship bore the markings of the Imperial Japanese Navy's Special Attack Corps, the kamikaze units that had conducted suicide attacks against American ships during the final months of the war. Explosive charges had blown holes in the destroyer's hull below the waterline, ensuring it would sink quickly rather than remain afloat long enough for capture. But the demolition work had been hurried, leaving structural damage that could be repaired if the Navy decided the vessel was worth salvaging. Vandegrift swam through the flooded compartments, noting that most of the ship's equipment had been removed before scuttling. The irony wasn't lost on him. Japanese naval engineers had used the same underwater demolition techniques that the UDT had pioneered, turning their own expertise against vessels they'd spent years building and training to operate. War had a way of forcing everyone to adopt the same methods, regardless of which side they started on. A motor launch approached their position at 11:37 hours, flying the flag of the harbor master's office and carrying a mixed crew of American and Japanese personnel. The boat's commanding officer, a Navy lieutenant commander wearing crisp khaki uniforms that looked strange after months of combat gear, hailed them through a megaphone to report that all underwater operations had been suspended pending formal surrender ceremonies. Vandegrift acknowledged the order and began swimming toward the pickup point, but part of him resisted leaving the water. These reconnaissance missions had become his normal existence, the dangerous routine that defined his purpose and gave meaning to the sacrifices his unit had made. Without an enemy to fight, without beaches to assault, without impossible missions to attempt, what would become of the naked warriors? The paperwork was already being prepared. discharge orders for enlisted personnel who wanted to return to civilian life, transfer orders for officers who might find slots in the peacetime Navy's reduced force structure, recommendations for medals and commendations that would gather dust in personnel files while the men who'd earned them struggled to find their place in a world that no longer needed their particular skills. Thomas climbed aboard the motor launch first, his movements showing the accumulated fatigue of 18 months in combat zones. Salt water had bleached his hair nearly white and carved lines around his eyes that made him look older than his 24 years. He'd lost 30 pounds since Kwajalein, muscle mass consumed by the physical demands of repeated combat missions. As Vandegrift pulled himself up onto the boat's deck, he realized that something irreplaceable was ending. Not just the war, but the brotherhood forged by shared danger and mutual dependence that had held the UDT together through impossible missions. Peacetime service would scatter these men across different assignments, different bases, different careers that might never bring them together again. The Japanese personnel on the boat treated the American swimmers with careful respect, offering dry towels and hot coffee, while maintaining the formal courtesy that their culture demanded even in defeat. One of them, a naval engineer who spoke fluent English, asked detailed questions about the underwater demolition techniques the Americans had used during the island campaigns. Vandegrift found himself answering honestly, describing the equipment modifications and tactical innovations that had evolved from mission to mission as they'd learned to counter Japanese defensive improvements. The information would be useless now that the war was over, but sharing it seemed like a gesture of professional respect between engineers who'd spent months trying to outwit each other. The motor launch tied up at a dock that had been cleared of debris and prepared for the arrival of occupation forces. American military police were checking identification papers and processing Japanese civilians who wanted to return to their homes in the naval district. The surrender had proceeded smoothly, without the resistance or sabotage that many had expected from a population indoctrinated to prefer death over dishonor. Vandegrift walked along the waterfront, noting the extensive damage caused by American bombing raids during the final months of the war. Entire city blocks had been reduced to rubble, with only concrete foundations remaining to mark where buildings had stood. Yet people were already beginning the work of reconstruction, clearing debris and salvaging materials that could be reused. The UDT would be disbanded within 6 months. Most of the swimmers would return to civilian life, taking jobs in construction, engineering, or commercial diving that utilized some of their specialized skills. A few might remain in the Navy, assigned to conventional units where their combat experience would be valued, but their tactical innovations would be forgotten. But something would survive. The lessons learned during 18 months of impossible missions. The proof that small units of highly trained specialists could accomplish objectives that conventional forces couldn't attempt. The understanding that innovation and adaptation mattered more than overwhelming firepower. The naked warriors had proven their worth. The question now was whether anyone would remember. The granite memorial overlooking Kwajalein Lagoon reflected the early morning sunlight on Memorial Day 2025, its polished surface etched with the names of 43 UDT swimmers who died during the Pacific Campaign 8 decades earlier. Commander Sarah Chen of SEAL Team 3 stood before the monument at 0700 hours, reading each name aloud to the 32 special operators assembled behind her in dress white uniforms that matched the ones worn by their predecessors during formal ceremonies aboard Navy ships. The water below sparkled the same blue-green as it had in 1944 when Lieutenant Alexander Vandegrift first swam toward these beaches, carrying nothing but demolition charges, and the conviction that impossible missions could be accomplished by men willing to risk everything. Chen had studied the after-action reports from that first UDT operation, poring over tactical diagrams and casualty lists until she understood exactly what those naked warriors had achieved with equipment that modern SEALs would consider primitive. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Rodriguez checked his dive watch, noting they had 17 minutes before the memorial ceremony would begin with full military honors. Rodriguez had completed 6 combat deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan, conducting direct action missions that utilized tactics developed from the innovations pioneered by Vandegrift's swimmers. The lineage was unbroken despite 8 decades of technological advancement and doctrinal evolution. The current SEAL teams bore little resemblance to the original UDT units, except for the fundamental principles that drove both organizations: small unit tactics, specialized training, and the willingness to attempt operations that conventional forces couldn't handle. Modern equipment included satellite communications, night vision systems, and precision weapons that would have seemed impossible to the men who'd fought with demolition charges and swim fins. Chen studied the tactical map mounted beside the memorial, showing the Japanese defensive positions that the UDT had penetrated during their first mission. The concrete bunkers were long gone, demolished by post-war construction projects that transformed Kwajalein into a missile testing facility. But the coral reef formations remained unchanged, still requiring the same underwater navigation skills that Van de Grift had mastered through trial and error. A delegation of elderly Japanese veterans had traveled from Tokyo to attend the ceremony, their presence representing a reconciliation that would have been unimaginable during the bitter fighting of 1944. One of them, Hiroshi Tanaka, had served as a teenage soldier in the garrison that defended against the first UDT assault. He'd spent 60 years researching the battle, eventually writing a book that praised the courage of the American swimmers who'd risked their lives to clear the beaches. The modern Navy SEALs conducted their missions with support from satellites, aircraft, and surface vessels equipped with technology that could locate and track individual swimmers anywhere in the world's oceans. But the fundamental challenge remained identical to what the naked warriors had faced: penetrating enemy defenses through stealth and precision, accomplishing objectives that seemed impossible, and returning alive to fight another day. Rodriguez pointed toward the lagoon where a small boat was approaching the memorial site, carrying the final group of ceremony participants. Among them was retired Captain John Thomas, 98 years old, and one of the last surviving members of the original UDT teams. Thomas had volunteered to speak at the ceremony despite his advanced age and the difficulty of traveling from his home in California to this remote Pacific atoll. The boat docked at 0743 hours, and Thomas walked slowly up the path toward the memorial with assistance from a Navy corpsman assigned to monitor his health during the ceremony. His movements showed the accumulated effects of multiple combat injuries and 8 decades of aging, but his eyes remained sharp and focused on the granite monument that bore the names of men who died beside him during impossible missions. Chen watched Thomas approach the memorial and recognized something in his bearing that connected him directly to the legend she'd studied in military history courses. This was a man who'd swum toward machine gun nests with nothing but explosives and determination, who'd proven that conventional wisdom about what was possible could be wrong when courage and innovation combined in the right proportions. The ceremony began at 0800 hours with the playing of taps by a Navy bugler positioned on the hill above the memorial site. The haunting melody echoed across the lagoon, where 80 naked warriors had once swum toward an enemy that considered them expendable, not knowing they were about to create the foundation for decades of special operations doctrine. Thomas stepped forward to address the assembled SEALs, his voice carrying across the water with the same authority that had commanded respect during combat missions when failure meant death for his entire team. He spoke about the fear that every UDT swimmer had felt before entering the water, the knowledge that they were attempting something that had never been tried before with equipment that might not work and tactics that existed only in theory. The old man described the moment when he'd realized that the impossible mission was actually succeeding, when Japanese defensive positions began exploding around him and the path to the beach suddenly opened for the Marines who would follow. That realization had transformed him from a swimmer with demolition charges into a special operator who understood that conventional limitations could be overcome through innovation and determination. Chen found herself thinking about her own team's recent missions in hostile environments, where success had depended on the same principles that guided the naked warriors: thorough preparation, tactical flexibility, and absolute commitment to accomplishing the objective regardless of personal cost. The technology had evolved, but the human elements remained constant. Thomas concluded his remarks by reading the names inscribed on the memorial, pausing after each one to allow the assembled SEALs to understand that these weren't just historical figures, but real men who'd made the ultimate sacrifice to prove that small units of specialists could change the course of warfare. 43 names representing 43 families who'd received telegrams explaining that their sons had died in service to their country. The ceremony ended with a 21-gun salute fired by Marines from the base security detachment, the rifle reports echoing across the lagoon where Japanese defenders had once fired at American swimmers. The sound gradually faded into the natural silence of a tropical morning, leaving only the gentle lapping of waves against the coral shore. As the official participants began dispersing, Chen remained beside the memorial, reading the tactical summary engraved below the names of the dead. 80 men had entered the water at Kwajalein, 37 had survived the war, 23 had remained in the Navy long enough to contribute to the development of the SEAL teams, the mathematics of sacrifice reduced to simple numbers on polished granite. Thomas approached her position and stood quietly beside the memorial for several minutes, apparently lost in memories of men who died 8 decades ago, but remained vivid in his recollection. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of experience that no amount of training could replicate. The Naked Warriors had accomplished something that seemed impossible in 1944, proving that innovation and courage could overcome any defensive position if applied with sufficient skill and determination. Their legacy lived on in every special operations mission conducted by forces that traced their lineage back to those first 80 swimmers. The mission continued. The Brotherhood endured. The impossible remained achievable for those willing to risk everything.